Well, good morning and hello, everybody around the world, whatever time it is. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives 3. We're very happy to welcome back Harley Schlanger after a brief respite. We are looking forward to catching up with Harley, and the news of the day couldn't be more really tense right now, I'd say. Would you agree with that? It's a tense time, Harley, and welcome back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, John. It's a very tense moment. The West is continuing to push for a Ukraine military victory. Ukraine's army is being decimated, but as long as they keep pouring in weapons, it appears that there's some people there that will keep fighting. And fighting for what? The idea of freedom of Ukraine, the idea of their sovereignty. You know, they have no sovereignty. Their president is a puppet of NATO. It's a real tragedy. I mean, as much as you want to see this thing end in a decent way, that's going to require something from the West, a change in the thinking in the West, and I don't see it happening.
Well, my fear is that the entire financial system depends upon them winning this war in Ukraine at this point. And if they are committed to it to the extent that they've put all the chips into the table, said if we are going to win this war, or après moi le déluge, you're not going to survive unless you let us win this war, people. So give us more money so we can send more arms to Mr. Zielinski, who himself today I read in RT, which for some reason I was allowed to see RT on Twitter today. I was, mirabilis. It was, but maybe Elon Musk is finally having some, I don't know, I won't go there. But let's get back to Zielinski, who's saying, I want to I want to solve this. I want to settle it, but there are people, there are forces, there are people that won't let me settle it. That was my impression. And a lot of other people have been saying this all along, that Zielinski would, he came into office behind any Have we lost you?
No, John?
Yes.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. You were cut off a little while ago.
Oh, I saw a glitch there.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
We were talking about Zelensky, and there was some interesting reporting coming from Poland and Hungary, where people in Poland are starting to spread the word that Zelensky's preparing to make an agreement with Poland, which is not acceptable to the Ukrainian army. And then there's another report from Hungary that they think Zelensky is cracking, that he's under so much pressure that he's saying different things at different times. One moment he's saying he's willing to talk. The next moment he's saying you can't talk until Russia's been defeated. I guess it depends on whether he's been talking with the British and the Americans before he goes out and makes his comments, or whether he's looking at the actual battlefield situation and realizing that it's hopeless. There was a report yesterday from a very well-known and reliable Russian military correspondent who said that 60% of the tanks in the most recent shipment to Ukraine were destroyed in these strikes outside of Kiev over the weekend. Now, why are we putting $60 billion of weapons, supposedly putting the weapons into Ukraine? I think this is why Rand Paul was so insistent that there be an investigation. How do we even know how much of that 60 billion is going to weapons and how much is going to help Raytheon move their headquarters to Washington, D.C.?
Raytheon is probably behind it. I would like to have you bring in, if you would, Kolomoisky. What is Kolomoisky's role in all this?
Well, he's one of the oligarchs who was very responsible for the Zelensky victory. He bankrolled Zelensky during his 2019 campaign, but at the same time, going back to 2014, he was one of the funders of the neo-Nazis, which is ironic because Kolomoisky is Jewish, has very close ties with the Mossad, and yet he was considered the sugar daddy of some of the neo-Nazi militia involved in the 2014 Maidan coup and afterwards. Now, apparently, the word is that after the coup and the fighting continued from 2014 to 2018, he broke with Poroshenko and put money behind Zelensky in the hopes that Zelensky would go ahead and negotiate to end the fighting in the East through adopting the Minsk Accord. But Kolomoisky's neo-Nazi brigades pressured Zelensky to not go along with Minsk. And as a result, the fighting continued. In fact, it escalated. So what is his ultimate aim? I think he wants to be the kingmaker. He has financial interests all over the Eastern Europe, the Middle East. It's hard to know what's in someone like that's mind. But what we do know is that Zelensky is under pressure from him and from the nationalist forces, the right-wing neo-Nazi forces, and also from the British and the Americans. And at this point, there's not much difference between the British and American voice and that of the neo-Nazis.
I left a moment of silence for that to resonate. It's chilling. It's horrible. It's just unbelievable to anybody that knows American history that we would be in this position. But yes, we are. And I don't know what to say. I mean, as far as the religious beliefs of a Kolomoisky or a Zelensky, I don't have any clue, and I'm not really interested. What I do know is what they do and what they say and the positions that they're in. And, I don't even, is the Mossad a religious organization? I don't attribute, what they do to religious conviction. I do attribute what they do to
I lost you again there, John.
Oh, this is what happened the last time I talked about the Great Britain, because they shut the whole show down immediately. Yeah, so maybe I shouldn't have said that. But there are certain people that run covert operations all over the place, and we don't know what they do, all that. But what about between Kolomoisky and NATO? What's that relationship?
That's something I couldn't really tell you, except that they have at this point parallel goals. What the first thing to do is start with what is NATO's interest in this whole thing. And this is where you can't separate NATO from the military-industrial complex. The idea that NATO is doing this to defend Europe is a complete fraud. Europe's military capability is weak. They're running out of weapons. They are providing weapons to Ukraine. They're being captured, destroyed, or used. And the militaries of these countries, they're trying to refurbish them with new tranches of money. I spoke with someone in the German Bundestag the other day who's involved in the budget. And what he said is that there's a huge fight over where they're going to come up with this extra $2 billion to $200 billion over the next few years in German defense spending, when you've just had an obvious breakdown of the German infrastructure. I don't know if you heard this, but over the weekend, there were 2 accidents of German trains. One killed 4 people that crashed outside the town of Garmisch. Garmisch is where the G7 summit is going to be later this month. So you have a breakdown of infrastructure. They're laying off teachers in kindergarten in Germany, and now they're supposed to come up with more money for tanks for Ukraine. So Europe and NATO is a mess. But what's the driving force in NATO? It's British geopolitics. And on that, there's an interesting quote from Frederick Kemp, who's the CEO of the Atlantic Council, who went nuts the other day in his weekly column. He said, "We have to be sure that Ukraine wins and Russia loses. There's no other outcome that's acceptable." So for people who say, well, NATO is doing this to defend Ukraine from Russia, no, they're doing this to destroy Russia. And that's where you have to get to the economic issue. And I did an update a couple of days ago comparing Putin on inflation with Biden on inflation. And I don't know if you saw that one, John, but it was fascinating. Start with Biden. Biden said inflation is actually a good sign that the US economy is up and running after the pandemic. Then 3 or 4 breaths later, he said Putin is responsible for inflation. So which is it? Is the economy up and running? Or did Putin cause the inflation by embargoes, which had nothing to do with inflation that started long before the Ukraine fight? Then Biden went on to say that most Americans the savings rate is up, the income is up, and people are feeling comfortable with the future. Well, in reality, the income dropped the last 2 months, the per capita average. The savings rate collapsed from something around 40% of disposable income to 6% of disposable income. Why did it collapse? How can you save when every penny you earn is going into milk and fuel and bread and necessities? You can't. So Biden is putting out a stream of lies. Now, I just want to quote a couple of things from Putin because this is really astute. If Americans could hear what Putin is saying, those who still think Putin is the evil communist KGB assassin who's trying to take over Europe, just listen to this. He said that it's the Wall Street process which is behind the food crisis and the attempts to blame it on Russia. It didn't begin with the Russian military operation. The money supply in the United States grew by $5.9 trillion in less than 2 years from February 2020 until the end of 2021. Actually, if Putin would have added the last quarter of 2019, it would be over 9 trillion. Then he said, and this is a funny statement, you'll get a kick out of this, this is unprecedented productivity of the money printing machines. Then he said the total cash supply grew by 38.6%. So it was this mistake made by US financial and economic authorities that led to the inflation. It has nothing to do with Russia's actions in Ukraine. Then on the energy costs, he said it's the Green Deal policies of the European Union, which overestimated the capabilities of alternative types of energy, such as solar and wind. These cannot be produced in the required amount with the required quality and at acceptable prices. And at the same time, they began to belittle the importance of conventional types of energy, including and above all hydrocarbons. Then he said, what was the result of all this? Banks stopped issuing loans because they were under pressure, which is true. This is Mark Carney and others. No more loans to hydrocarbon exploration, transportation of oil and gas, etc. Insurance companies stopped insuring deals. Local authorities stopped allocating plots of land for expanding agricultural production and reduced the construction of special transport, including pipelines. This is what led to a shortage of investment in the world energy sector and price hikes as a result. So he then went on to talk about how, nevertheless, Russia is working with the OPEC Plus. You may have heard this. There was enormous pressure put on Saudi Arabia to kick Russia out of OPEC Plus. OPEC Plus is the original countries plus Russia and a few others. Saudis refused. So then Biden said he's going to make a trip to Saudi Arabia. This was covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And after it was in those papers, it caused up some controversy because Biden said he was going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state because of the Khashoggi affair. So who did they trot out to justify this? None other than Secretary of State empty head Blinken. And Blinken said, look, the Saudis have been an extremely important ally for us in the fight against extremism. Well, maybe he meant to say the Saudis were an important ally with us in funding extremist networks, because the Saudis and the US trained Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. So, the whole thing with Biden and the West is a jumble of confusion and lies and corruption. Whereas Putin's straightforward. He said, look, yeah, of course we're seeing shortages in food, but I'm working with other countries to deal with it. So maybe you want to chew on this a little bit, and then I have some more for you on the shift going on in the global South, which is really quite extraordinary.
As far as our economy, it seems to me that our economy is being actively undermined. It's not just a question of stupidity. It's not just a question of political expediency. There is behind all this is and you and the Schiller and LaRouche folks have been very, very good at pointing out what is called the LaRouche's three curves, and how when productivity goes down and speculative investment goes up, and we're we're going off a cliff, in other words.
Yeah.
And somebody has been pushing us toward that cliff for some time. And I think it's people that know how to manipulate the financial system to their own benefit. I can't put names on them, but this is.
Here's a name for you.
Yeah.
George Shultz.
Okay.
Because this began in the 1970s, where Schultz and others were pushing the idea of the US becoming a post-industrial economy that outsourced all of our industry and manufacturing and advanced the service sector. And for them, the service sector included insurance and finances, real estate, but it also included artificial intelligence, computers, and so on. The idea being that through that, we could control these other countries that we're outsourcing our production to, so we could keep the wages low and therefore have cheap goods for the United States. Now, that has been blown apart, largely because with the US dependent on this global supply chain, we just saw recently the effects of that, but this has been in the works for the last 30 years. The idea of the post-industrial economy, Schultz, people like Hank Paulson, the people who crafted Bush's economic policies, Mark Carney, they're all greenies. They all believe that there are too many people, not enough resources, and therefore we have to save the scarce resources by killing off excess populations. That for them is a calculated economic intention. And that's why LaRouche was so viciously attacked for years, because he not only proved that's what they were doing, but we quoted them where they actually came out, like Kissinger's National Security Study Memo 200, where he said in the developing sector, there are too many people. They can't have it. We've got to figure out a way to cut it down. So, we're dealing with Malthusian lunatics who are powerful enough because of their control of money to control political offices, to control governments, to control legislatures. And so, where stupidity comes in, I think a lot of congressmen are just greedy and stupid. But I think the people who are drafting these policies have a very clear intention. And this is spelled out in some of the documents from Davos and the World Economic Forum, the Bilderbergers, Brzezinski was clear on this. But a lot of this goes back to Schultz and the crowd that he was in. And where did he come from? He came from the group of people who ran the trusts and corporations that funded Hitler after World War I and that supported British geopolitics after World War II by turning NATO into a division of the world into two empires. And that's still what NATO is today. They're trying to have two empires that are competing rather than actually trying to reach a peaceful agreement with Russia and China.
Well, thank you. I do believe that we have to face this as a nation. That not only are things going to hell in the handbasket, but there's somebody that's pushing us to hell and creating circumstances that are going to drive us over that cliff if we don't stand up and stop them. And then that's the other great aspect of you guys' work, is that you do have a plan. You have a plan to stop this horrible financial system from completing its inevitable destruction of the planet and humanity along with it. And so let's talk a little bit about what you think we really need to do, Harley.
Well, before we get to that, let me just give you this picture from what's going on in the global south, because this is something
Oh,
that's
I'm sorry.
never reported in the United States. There was a forum in the city of Bratislava, which was in Slovakia and the Czech Republic were the two countries there. And the main speaker was the Indian External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. And he was asked, why are you helping Russia? Why are you sitting on the fence in this confrontation in Ukraine? Now, here's what the foreign minister of India had to say. He rejected the idea that they're a fence sitter, because he said, we reject the idea that we have to choose to ally with one or another power axis, either the Europe and the US on the one hand or Russia and China on the other. He said, do not think it's necessary for India to join any axis. India is entitled to its own choices, which will be a balance of its values and interests. I'm not sitting on the fence just because I don't agree with you. It means I'm sitting on my ground. Now, then they said, yes, but what's happening in Europe is terrible and you're letting it go on. And he said, you have to face something. A lot is happening outside of Europe. The world is changing and new players are coming in. The world can't be Eurocentric anymore. Now, take that word Eurocentric and substitute unipolar. And that's what he's saying. That we're not going to bow down to a Wall Street London axis. He went on to say Europe has to grow out of its mindset that its problems are the world's problems, but that the world's problems aren't Europe's problems. And he went on to say that, well, what about India's purchases of Russian oil? Isn't this helping Putin in the war? And he said, look, if countries from the West, from Europe, from the US are so concerned, why don't they allow Iranian oil to come to the market? Why don't they allow Venezuelan oil to come to the market? So he's standing up for the whole interests of the former colonial world, the developing sector. Then there was an attempt to have the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, excluding Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. So the Mexican president said he's not going. He said this is the old strategy of dictating policies to the non-Western countries. We're not going to support that. And half a dozen other countries, heads of state, also are boycotting the summit, which was Blinken's idea to have a summit to pull together all of Latin America against Russia and China. It didn't work. Then you have the effort to blame the food shortages in Africa on Russia, which is the other line. Russia's blockading the ports, Russia's withholding the grain. So there was a very fascinating event on June 3rd. The African Union chairman, Macky Sall, who's the president of Senegal, and the head of the African Union Commission met with Putin in Sochi. And they had a long talk about how to get more grain into especially East Africa, where there's a lot of hunger right now. And after the meeting, this is the tweet from President Sall. He said, President Putin has expressed to us his availability to facilitate the export of Ukrainian cereals. Russia is ready to ensure the export of its wheat and fertilizer. I call on all partners, referring to the rest of the world, to lift sanctions on wheat and fertilizer, because the Russians aren't allowed to send it. He said sanctions, this is, again, the African Union president, sanctions against Russia worsened the situation with grain and fertilizer supplies to the African countries. And he said at the press briefing after the meeting, We are leaving here very reassured and very happy with our exchanges. And he said he found Putin committed and aware that the crisis and the sanctions create serious problems for weak economies, such as the African economies. Now, keep in mind that twice Zelensky requested to be able to address the leaders of the African Union, and twice he was rebuffed. They said they had no reason to listen to him. They don't want to get involved in European arms sales and sanctions. So here you have Africa, Latin America, and one of the most important countries in Asia. The Indian foreign minister pointed out that India has about a fifth of the world's population and is the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. These are not small countries. They're not going along with this either you're for us or against us. So when you start to craft a solution, the two things you need: one, who's causing the problem and what's their intention, which we just covered before, going back to Schultz and this idea of the unipolar order. The second question then is, who can be rallied to create an alternative system? Because if a system's collapsing, if it's threatening much of the world's population, and now is boomeranging back against the populations and the nations that it's supposedly defending, as the high prices are, as the oil embargo is, and so on, we could have the majority of the world on the path toward a solution of a just economic system that's not a globalist system where you give up sovereignty, but where sovereign nations come together and address in full discussion what's in the best interest for their country and how that can be incorporated into the interests of other countries. That's what the Schiller Institute is calling for, a conference which would adopt a new security architecture and a new financial architecture. Years ago, Lyndon LaRouche said the key to this is 4 countries: Russia, China, India, and the United States. I think we have Russia, China, and India online with this, including key economic figures like Sergei Glaziev in Russia, who is committed to LaRouche's ideas of energy flux density, potential relative population density, productivity being the point of a whole physical economy. Where's the problem then? It's the US. And I think most people in the United States, if given a choice, would prefer to look at the system that LaRouche has proposed than to continue with this speculative system of funny money, which benefits less than 1% of the population, while impoverishing and immiserating the rest of the population. And the main thing we have to do is break through this media control and get people to start thinking, not thinking in terms of profiles, but actually thinking like strategic citizens, the way the founding fathers did when they figured out how to build a global alliance to defeat the British. And John, this is just the last point I want to make as sort of a prologue. The founding fathers were not opposed to the idea of working with other countries. Their idea was not America first in that we don't need the rest of the world. It's that if we are good and our intent is good, then we should be able to organize other countries to support us. And that's exactly what Benjamin Franklin was doing in the whole second half of the 18th century, when he spent a lot of time in Europe. That's what one of his proteges, John Quincy Adams, was doing as US ambassador in France and Russia. That's what the American system, Peshine Smith, was doing in Japan. That's what Cassius Marcellus Clay was doing in Russia as the US ambassador to Russia, spreading the idea of the American system and getting support from the rest of the world. You know, when you talk to some of the people who got pulled into the Trump movement, it was unfortunately the idea of America first meant we can't trust any other country. No, the idea of America first should be we'll take care of our own problems through physical production, but we'll do it in collaboration with the rest of the world. There's no reason to freeze them out or to see the rest of the world as enemies. The real enemies we have are Wall Street and London.
Wall Street and London, right. and all of the tentacles that extend from there, both legal and illegal, and overt and covert, um, um, visible and invisible, overt and secret, and the secret societies, the secret society speech of JFK just reminds me of that. And that's when we lost it. We lost it when they killed President Kennedy, and the people that run those secret operations are still running the world. We have our founding fathers' documents, we have our Constitution, and we have our sense of who we are still as Americans. Although there's a great mass psychological warfare effort to destroy even our memory of who we are and what we stand for, and turn us back into a bunch of serfs that can be interchanged like pieces in a Lego set. That,
And John, here's something interesting that you and I have been talking about before the last couple of weeks. This World Health Organization effort, which supposedly was going to strip sovereignty from the United States. Now, I know you and I had an email exchange on this. There's no way an international organization can take sovereignty from the United States if the United States is going to stand up for its own sovereign rights, because our Constitution is a sovereign document. But here's what's interesting. While Biden and Blinken and others were willing to sign on to this document, who sabotaged it? African nations. They didn't want to give up their sovereignty. And so the drafting and acceptance of this new treaty was put off because of the Africans standing up against it. That's what I mean when I say we have allies all over the world. President Sall of Senegal is an example, or South Africa, or the Egyptians, the Algerians, the Nigerians. What do they want? They want development. They want nuclear power. They want space programs. They want to be able to feed their population. And we know how to do that if we are not allowing the corporate cartels to dictate economic policy. And that's what the fight is, to take the power back to the institutions of self-government of our federal republic, take it back from the corporate cartels that own the Congress.
On that issue of the amendments to the WHO charter that were going to be presented generally by the Biden administration, as I recall, there were 12 amendments that were at stake. And as a result of public pressure, including that from Africa, but also from a number of Americans,
United States, yeah.
Including my colleague Mark Kulaks at HousatonicITS.com, who is one of the leaders in researching this connection between bioweapons labs, COVID, and the financial disaster that we've been facing. Because I have to say that when we acknowledge that, yes, the African nations had a case, they were right. There was a danger that our sovereignty would be slipped away with these amendments. Then the people that have been fighting for that over here in America should also be given credit, because I think it's frightening how difficult it is to get out a word like this out into the world. And how many times has his channel and my channel, so many others, just been attacked and struck down because we even mention the idea that this might be possible, that there is a dark hidden hand behind this this PLANDEMIC. And I am still of the opinion that because, and the technicality of it is that there was already language that was passed in 2005, which created the possibility that if certain words were deleted from that language in this amendment, then that achievement would have been made. And as we know, in many, many ways, it just takes a little bitty thing for them to go over that slippery slope. And then all of a sudden, they've achieved their goal. Even, it's like, it's like the Germans when they decided to invade Poland, well, all they had to do was create a small little lie about these guys going over and taking over a radio station, and boom, they've justified it in their own minds, and they do it. And that's the kind of justification, this flimsy justification that they need, and they will just drive a tank right through it if you give them a slight opening. So I'm glad to think that people like Mark and others that I'm in touch with are making an impact. I want to go back to the whole question of that infusion of huge amounts of money into the financial system. And I want to suggest that that is absolutely tied to the big pharma who got a big injection of American taxpayer money and the dilution of our money into inflation, which is, what is the biggest cause of the inflation we're suffering right now, except for this billion-dollar, trillion-dollar, multiple trillion-dollar commitment to buy all kinds of products from big pharma and insert them into people's bodies. And that commitment, if you needed to have an excuse to further weaken our financial system, that did it. And I think it really does. I can go back to the Paris Accords, and when Trump averted us from that disaster, then they thought, oh, we need another disaster. And then so they keep creating another disaster that will justify a huge pile of money being created out of nothing. And you know where that heads. That goes right off the cliff. So whether it is or not, these dark people, they do have control of things behind the scenes. And some of the things I'm afraid they have control of are very, very dark biological weapons in BSL-4 labs stashed around the country. And we have got to face that. And I don't think the WHO is reliable to stand up to that kind of threat.
Well, that's why the U.S. is so hesitant to allow the Russians to present the case about the biological labs in Ukraine to the United Nations. And that's why when the UN ambassador from Russia tried to present the case, everyone walked out. But, John, when you talk about the big pharma, that's one of the areas of money. But we're talking now about $130 trillion, which is tied up in the green policy and derivative speculation. Because as much as you can point to big pharma as a culprit, they're one of the corporate cartels that are a culprit. But they're small when you compare it to the quadrillion dollars of trading that goes on every day in derivatives markets. And this is where you see, I don't know if you saw this week, but Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, said, we're about to get hit by a hurricane. And he said, the only question is, will it be a small storm or will it be a superstorm? Now, when JP Morgan Chase is talking about that, you realize we're talking about something big. The money supply has been expanded by somewhere between $9 and $23 trillion since the fourth quarter of 2019. No one has the exact figures, and some of it gets extended and then pulled back, but it's over 9 trillion, and it may be as much as 23 trillion. Now, what does that mean for the value of the dollar? Because where is that going? It's going into speculation. It's going into propping up bankrupt companies. It's going into speculators who are using it to buy the stocks of their companies, which aren't making enough profit to pay the interest on the debt. So as this money expansion goes on, it's increasing the overall debt. And as the debt comes due, what do? They bail it out again. Now, the problem is the more you do that, the more you weaken both the dollar, and as you pointed to LaRouche's triple curve, as you have financial aggregates going up and you need a certain amount of monetary aggregates to keep it liquid, you cut the spending fully into the productive sector. Because a steel mill, while it makes sense to invest in modern steel production, the most efficient steel production, it doesn't give you the rate of profit you can get by selling a swaption or a poption or making up some new financial instrument. But there's nothing backing that new financial instrument, whereas with a steel mill, you're producing something of value to the society. So this is where we've gone off the deep end, and this does go back to your old friend George P. Shultz, Paul Volcker, the crew around Milton Friedman, that were advising Nixon in the early 70s, Arthur Burns. These were the British monetarists who were interested in preserving the British Empire, not in rebuilding the somewhat weakened physical economy of the United States. Kennedy was trying to rebuild the physical economy, and they killed him. And they killed him precisely because he was looking at the difference between national banking, a national credit system, and the Federal Reserve System. That was the existential threat to the British Empire. Now, even in his own way, when Trump was talking about the Federal Reserve, it raised some hackles, but he never fundamentally challenged it. He stuck with people like Mnuchin. Now what we see with Biden is Jerome Powell is one of the architects of the quantitative easing policy. Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, was one of the architects of this when she was Federal Reserve Chair. Yellen now is admitting that she was wrong when she said that the quantitative easing was causing, she said it would be a mild inflation. Well, she's saying she was wrong about that, but what's her solution now? Well, if you really raise the interest rates as high as some people are talking, like Dudley, the former head of the New York Fed, is saying it should go up 5%. If you do that, you're going to have chain reaction corporate bankruptcies, and that could be unstoppable. On the other hand, if you keep pumping the liquidity, you're going to weaken the dollar and the dollar system further, and you're going to increase the desire of other countries to get out of the dollar system. And that's ultimately what's behind the Ukraine situation. Russia was not willing to accept having the ruble become a funny money currency attached to London banks. The Chinese, whatever you may think of the Chinese, they refused to allow Western-style banks come into China and hook China into the derivative markets. In fact, they jailed some of the bankers who were trying to do that. Now you look at Indonesia, you look at Brazil, you look at some of these more advanced of the so-called developing sector countries. They don't want a speculative economy. They want physical economic goods production. And so this is where the more the US does for quantitative easing, the more it does to attack Russian and Chinese sovereignty, the more they're convincing countries they have to end up siding with Russia and China. And so it's the Western narrative which is creating the likelihood of a complete collapse of the dollar system. Now, we don't want to see the dollar system collapse immediately and completely because that would unleash chaos in the world. But we don't want to protect the funny money speculative system. And we want to create a negotiated bankruptcy reorganization in which the major banks like JP Morgan Chase are forced to write down huge volumes of their derivatives portfolio and eat the losses. And if they can survive after doing that, fine, let them be a normal bank. If they can't survive, it's no big loss to humanity. But if you just let it blow up, that would be a loss because it would just lead to complete chaos and social anarchy in the streets. So we need an organized bankruptcy reorganization. And that's what we're going to be discussing June 18th and June 19th. If you go to the schillerinstitute.com website, there's an invitation to a 2-day online discussion, which will be on this question of how organized bankruptcy can create a new financial architecture as the basis for a new security architecture. Now, we've had very successful seminars recently. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but Colonel Richard Black, a very prominent military leader, the former head of the criminal division of the U.S. Army at the Pentagon, he spoke at our last conference with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, with a leading French defense figure, with the former head of the Italian Air Force. This was this was on May 26th. So if people are interested, you can go to the Schiller Institute and watch that discussion. But we're going to extend it. There it is, the Schiller Institute online conference. No peace without bankruptcy reorganization. And it can happen much quicker than most people think.
No peace without bankruptcy reorganization. That's starting to get close to a slogan. Um, Put a hashtag in front of it and just tighten it up just a little bit, and I think we might have something we could sell. That has to become the theme. I agree with you completely that reorganizing the banks through a bankruptcy proceeding is the only way to restore the peace of the world. The peace
And
of
John,
the
as a part of that, you could then move toward a real regulation of the pharmaceutical industry, a real regulation of the grain cartels who are conspiring to make sure there's not enough food for the world. So that you can have monopoly antitrust legislation to address these cartels. But it starts with the banks and the insurance companies because they wield so much power.
And each one of them, I would remind everybody, is a corporation. And each corporation was created by a government charter. And the power to create is the power to destruct. And if anybody thinks that corporations are more powerful than governments, let them just write the name corporation on a piece of paper, pick it up and rip the piece of paper into tiny pieces, because that's what governments can do. Governments can do that. They must do that in cases of extreme abuse of their corporate powers. And that's what we're facing right now. It's extreme abuse of the charters that are granted by governments over, nobody thought corporations were going to be eternal entities. The whole idea, this like we're back to the slippery slope again. You're going to make a corporation to do some public good. Hey, we could make more. We could produce more grain if we could sell it. If we could sell it to the town over there across the river. Hey, why don't we build a bridge? Great idea. Let's build a bridge. How do we do that? We got to get some capital together. Okay, let's make a bridge corporation. Boom. Build the bridge, dissolve the corporation. Everybody's happy. No, you build the bridge and then you say, hey, we made some money on that bridge. Let's build another bridge. And the next thing you know, you're in the bridge building business instead of serving the government's original purpose of simply facilitating commerce and transportation for the good of all the people. That's the old story. And right now, I think that's what we have. We have out of control institutions that are even given the rights of human rights by our Supreme Court. That's how prostituted all of our legal system is to the idea that we could be giving the freedom of speech rights to a corporation. Write that down on the piece of papers, and this piece of paper has the freedom to speak, and then tear that up because it's all a sham. It's all a horrible, horrible sham.
John, one of the indications of the power of the popular rebellion that's underway, you mentioned the WHO and the discussion process around that. Think about what happened to this Department of Countering Disinformation.
Yeah.
What was it called? The Disinformation Governance Board, under this whack job, Nina Jankowicz. The reason they shut it down so quickly is because we were exposing the fact that Nina Jankowicz was an open apologist of the Nazis in Ukraine, because she was deployed by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was at the center of the Ukraine coup in 2014. She was deployed through the Integrity Initiative, a British intelligence operation, into Ukraine in 2017, 2018, to work with that Ukrainian Disinformation Governance Bureau. Now, the people who set up that Disinformation Governance Bureau were part of the Azov Battalion, they were set up to make the case that anyone who says there are Nazis in Ukraine is pushing Putin's line. And that's what Jankowicz was going to do. Now, at the center of that was something called Stop Fake, which was the first fact-checking website. And who became its partner? Facebook. They were partners with this Nazi-run disinformation agency that had Jankowicz as one of their fronts. Now, interestingly, in the last 3 weeks, the current Ukrainian Disinformation Governance Board has named Helga Zepler-Rouge, Colonel Richard Black, Ray McGovern, and me as Putin apologists for our coverage of the Nazi roots of the Azov battalion. So, they're extending their reach. Now, but what happened to Jankovich? She's gone. The Disinformation Governance Board is in limbo. They're trying to reconstitute it with none other than Michael Chertoff as someone who's at least now behind the scenes. But remember who he was. He was the one of the original faces behind the post 9/11. What was it called? The Central Agency, the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security under Bush. So he's a much more serious person than Jankovich. He's not going to sing a Mary Poppins song about disinformation. He's just going to come in and throw people in jail. Now, I don't know if you saw this, but this is just, to me, so interesting. Even the Ukrainian parliament had to fire the woman who was the parliamentary official in charge of smoking out disinformation, because she was the source of the story that Russian soldiers raped a 1-year-old girl and then killed her. And this story spread everywhere. It showed, I'm sure it was in your local newspaper, wherever you are in the United States. Turned out she made it up. And even the Ukrainian government had to fire her. So this is the kind of network that Nina Jankovich had produced and was working with when she was brought in by Biden to head up the censorship agency, whose purpose was not just to censor others, but to spread disinformation. So that's how, when you talk about corporations and corporate control, in order to keep this war going, to keep the billions of dollars flowing into the defense contracts, to keep the killing going, to disable Russia, to try and isolate Russia and China, all of this is coming from these corrupt networks that go so far as to fund Nazis and then deny that these Nazis exist. It's a sad story.
Over the weekend, I found speaking about denying Nazis, and Klaus Schwab, his heritage. I don't know if you've done any study into that, but there's a fantastic article on that published at fbcoverup.com. I'll put it in the show notes after the show. These folks are associated with Michael McKibben, as far as I can tell, but it says it's done by anonymous patriots, and it's 62 pages of incredible disclosures about Schwab, his father, their company Escher Wyss, and slave labor, nuclear things, and all kinds of other stuff that I think does tell us that the people that are trying to take over the world are the same people that were financing and supporting and even belonging to the Nazi party in World War II. And this is it's unbelievable. It's just absolutely unbelievable to a person that grew up like I did, with a kind of a liberal mindset that yeah, we've got our checks and balances, and yeah, things, they fight left and right, back and forth, but basically everything's fine. No, everything is not fine. Everything has been infiltrated, and we are in a heck of a lot of trouble, in my humble opinion. But with your help, Harley, perhaps we can get our way out of it.
We just have to inspire people to realize that they can outthink these guys, because these guys are essentially going to be brought down by their own evil intention. But it's not going to be pleasant, and it'd be better if we did it in an organized way than just let the whole thing collapse on our heads. So June 18th and June 19th, sign up for our online conference at the schillerinstitute.com. And I think you'll find it quite liberating to know that there are people all over the world who are working with us to make sure this story gets out.
By the way, I noticed that Diane Sayre had a great success recently and got the signatures for the ballot for the Senate of New York. to contend against Chuck Schumer. And I wish her well. And for our audience, if you want to support somebody that can make a difference in a very important jurisdiction, I would say Diane Sare is your person. Vote for Diane Sare if you can, and support her in any way you can.
She's running against Chuck Schumer.
Yeah.
And they raised the requirements from 15,000 petition signatures to 45,000 petition signatures to get on the ballot. They never thought we did it. And a bunch of volunteers went up to New York State and got it done. And it shocked everyone. We'll find out by 4 o'clock today, Eastern time, if she's officially accepted on the ballot. We expect they might try some shenanigans, but otherwise we did the job, and I'm sure she'll be happy to know you recognize that she did it.
Oh, I follow her closely on Twitter, and I think everyone should. And yourself, Harley, also on Twitter, and at SchillerInstitute.com, LaRouche organization, and so many wonderful articles at EIR, Executive Intelligence Review. Harley, you're a treasure. Thank you so much for this morning's hour.
I'll see you in another 2 weeks, John.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.